Hello and welcome to The Vaccine. I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Coming up, changes to quarantine and easing travel restrictions for vaccinated Australians. The Prime Minister announces a plan to transition out of the pandemic. And we hear about the challenges of the vaccine rollout for GPs. Well, National Cabinet has agreed to work towards a four-stage plan to return Australia to normal post-pandemic. It'll first see the temporary halving of the number of international arrivals to mitigate the risks of the Delta strain. Under Phase 2, vaccinated Australians will experience fewer restrictions, lockdowns and state border controls. The third stage is likely to involve scrapping lockdowns altogether and abolishing caps on vaccinated returned travellers. Stage 4 should roughly represent life largely returning to normal. These phases are conditional on vaccination thresholds.
That's the gate that we have to get through. Once we get through that gate, and that'll be determined by the scientific evidence, then we will move into a phase where we seek to minimise serious illness, hospitalisation and fatality as a result of COVID-19. That's the objective.
We'll get more analysis on this in just a moment, but first Casey Briggs joins us. Casey.
Hi Jeremy. Well, there's been a lot going on this week. The news has moved so fast it almost feels like we're back in March 2020, back when we were describing everything happening in the country as unprecedented. Well, there's been a lot of unprecedenteds happening this week, an unprecedented number of leaks from our protective quarantine barrier, 8 of them since the beginning of June. A combination of hotel quarantine leaks, plus leaks out of airport flight crews and from hospitals. We've seen also, as all of these states across the country are managing COVID-19 outbreaks, an unprecedented number of people getting tested as well. On Thursday, 155,000 swabs were reported across the country. And we're also seeing an unprecedented number of Delta cases being found in hotel quarantine. The number of overall overseas cases in hotel quarantine has been pretty flat for a while now on a weekly basis, except for a spike in April. But what is changing is these cases are getting riskier. New South Wales is publishing weekly data about the cases they're finding in hotel quarantine. In the most recent data that we've got for the most recent 4-week period, 23% of all of the cases in hotel quarantine were of the Delta strain, and that number is going up. And it's not quite unprecedented, but we're seeing some really big drops in movement in Sydney, as that city is about halfway through its lockdown, 2-week lockdown. According to these Apple Maps mobility data, about a third, public transport map lookups are about a third of where they were pre-pandemic, and they've halved just in the past fortnight. Not quite, well, this is the lowest it's been since April 2020. There's been one other unprecedented as well this week, and that's that we're now having a conversation about what the coronavirus endgame looks like. National Cabinet's agreement to make a plan, to set a target, to move to a new phase. Vaccine horizons permitting, of course. There's a lot of detail lacking there, and this doesn't foresee lockdowns coming to an end anytime soon. But at least we are now having a conversation about charting a course out of this cursed pandemic.
Casey, thank you. Let's get some analysis now on this new roadmap announced by the Prime Minister. Karen Middleton is the Chief Political Correspondent for the Saturday paper. She joins us now. Karen, good to see you. This represents a significant policy shift for the government, doesn't it?
It does. I think a lot of us who analyse these things have been calling for some time for some kind of dismount strategy, for a plan to show us how we're going to get out of this crisis phase, which seems to be just chugging along forever, and onto a path that will take us back to normal life. And I think that we're seeing the start of that, and it will really help to reassure people, or I hope it will, that there is an end ultimately to this, and we will get to some kind of normal where we will live with this virus like we live with other viruses.
Why now? What's behind the timing of this? I mean, we're concurrently seeing lockdowns in 3 states in the Northern Territory, so this really pointed how crucial this is for the government.
Yeah, I think over the past week there's been a sense of high anxiety around the country. I think everybody last year was really willing to drop everything and take these hard moves, be in lockdown, because we felt that it was going to get better. Everybody felt that it had got better, and that all of a sudden we're going backwards again, and there's a sense of anxiety that vaccination hasn't happened fast enough. When is this going to end? And I really think that's been the impetus for making sure they could make this announcement now. now. Business couldn't be sure what was going to happen. It was very uncertain for business. No JobKeeper anymore. Half the country has the anxiety of being in lockdown. The other half is wondering when it's going to happen to them. And just the sense of how long is this going to go on? When will the end be? Not that we've got dates and timetable really for this plan, but at least we now have a plan and a sense, okay, there is somebody is looking at how we're going to get out of this.
There has been some criticism on the government in the last few hours about the lack of detail, the lack of firm targets and dates for this roadmap to play out. Is that a fair criticism of the government, given there are so many unknowns right now?
Well, I guess they're a bit damned if they do and damned if they don't. They're obviously very nervous that if they set firm targets that they'll be accused of not having met them because, of course, we heard targets initially about vaccination that were just out the window completely. But I do think you need some kind of target. Otherwise, how do you know when you're getting there? So, you've got to find a middle ground between those two things. We do know from the Prime Minister's news conference today that he is suggesting that phase 2, which is when things will start to open a little bit more and when we might see home quarantine, for example, and some of the current restrictions ease a bit, is probably going to be into next year. We're likely to have these reduced caps that we've seen put in place today or announced today from mid-July. We're likely to have those all through the rest of this year and into next year. So I don't think anyone should assume this is going to happen fast. And the suggestion that we're all going to be moving again, I think it's not until third phase, which is likely to be later next year, that we're going to see people able to travel more freely out of the country. So, this is going to take a while and it is a little bit vague on the timetables, but I think we are also seeing very clearly that what we are looking at is now a clear distinction between people who've been vaccinated and people who haven't. The sorts of easing of restrictions and travel movements in and out of the country are really favouring people who've been vaccinated. And if people choose not to be vaccinated, they're not going to get the benefits of these kinds of things that have been announced.
Karen, what do you make of the quality of the public health messaging in the past week, particularly around the desirability of AstraZeneca for under 60s? It seems that you could ask just about anyone in politics or in medicine and everyone's got a different answer.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Look, it's been terrible and it's been very confusing. And I think that has added to the stress that I was just talking about, this sense that who is in charge, what advice are we listening to? In a sense, the government's boxed itself in a little bit because, of course, it's been saying all along we must listen to the medical advice. Now, we've been reminded in the last few days that not all the medical advice is the same. Different doctors have different views and we've heard some of those expressed. But when you say you're always going to listen to the medical advice, well, ultimately, political considerations come into it as well. And I don't necessarily mean that in a nefarious way. I just mean people leading governments have to think about other things as well as health. I'm not minimising the health considerations, but they're also thinking about the economy and the state of the nation generally. So at some point, the Prime Minister was always going to have to weigh up these things against each other. And having said all along we will only listen to the health advice and do nothing, when you're starting to transition out of that to balancing all of these things together, you get yourself caught up a bit. And I do think that his message in relation to AstraZeneca was confusing, and maybe it was because there's pressure on the supply of the Pfizer vaccine. Maybe he wants to encourage people to hurry along, and we're not going to see much Pfizer till later in the year. But it has resulted in a lot of confusion, and I don't think that's been helpful.
Karen Middleton, always good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Dr Mukesh Haikerwal is with us now. He's a GP and former head of the Australian Medical Association. Dr Haikerwal, welcome to the program again. How much confusion has there been on the front line among health workers or for health workers trying to explain the latest advice on AstraZeneca particularly and whether people should forge ahead with that program?
Jeremy, I think it's been a fraught program from the outset, and many of the issues that have come to light, including the need for a no-fault compensation scheme so that every citizen who has a vaccine, who has a misadventure, is looked after. And if we do follow the ATAGI advice, which is that you shouldn't at the moment give AstraZeneca to anybody who is under 60, but, and this is the but, if there is a good reason to do it, you can do it as long as you've taken informed consent. But without that no-fault compensation scheme, which had been talked about by the Prime Minister on Monday, you were exposed. So all that's happened is that the rules haven't changed, really. What has changed is that there is indemnity if there is a decision made to change. And of course, this has become quite necessary because we started on the 22nd of March vaccinating, and we had all age groups. And then shortly after that, we were cut down to only people over 50. And then only a couple of weeks ago, it went down to everybody over 60. So then you had a tier of 40 to 50, 50 to 60, and there's now 40 to 60. So yes, it's confusing. But we're rolling with the punches because, the evidence changes, the rules will therefore change, and we've got to make sure we keep people up to date with the best information, and then we can help advise the right people. Wherein lies the problem? We were never actually, there was never any missive sent out to us. We're relying on the media like everybody else, which I think is a bit of a sad situation, a sad reflection on how poorly the health providers are regarded by the departments, and that they need to be much more in the tent and working together rather than just getting information from media, which is a good source by all means, but actually we should be in the tent.
Let's take a look at those who are in the tent. The Queensland Chief Health Officer was one of those this week accused of undermining the vaccination program with her remarks about AstraZeneca and its suitability for people under the age of 60. We've seen similar inconsistencies around the country, around the merits of short lockdowns, border closures. Does the medical community and those who are in the tent, as you say, share some responsibility for this confusion?
I think, I have done hours of interviews, and when I look at what actually then gets published or broadcast, it's a very small snippet of the nuanced discussion that we have over those interviews. So, I think that the message is probably the same from everyone. We believe in ATAGI. ATAGI is a robust body with high-ranking, respected individuals giving us their advice. The interpretation advice is also the same. In other words, if you are under 60, you can get AstraZeneca if you've got that informed consent. But nobody would do it generally without that indemnity that was advised about on Monday night. And I think that's a positive thing. Now, in terms of what Jeanette Young said, you can understand that because we are in a low risk environment at the moment with low rates of transmission. If we were sitting in another country like Indonesia or Papua New Guinea or in India, with that level of infection, it's a different equation. If you was also in a situation where you had high amounts of other vaccine available, that would also be fine. But we don't have much of the other vaccine. And so you have to make a choice. Do I have a vaccine or not? And if it's going to be AstraZeneca, is my situation, my medical situation dire? Is my prevailing level of information, prevailing level of infection going to make me more at risk? So these are individual discussions that have to be had before people can make their mind up about whether it's the way to go. So I don't think anybody's actually saying different things. I just think the way that they're saying them and the scenarios that they're talking about is making it difficult to comprehend because it's a different thing, in a press release with a press conference with the Prime Minister on Monday night compared to a press conference with the Premier of Queensland and the CEO of the CHO over there, which was a different set of circumstances being discussed. But it all gets conflated as the same thing, and it's not.
The roadmap that the Prime Minister's announced points to eventually treating people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated differently, that the restrictions would apply differently depending on whether you've had the vaccination. Is that a good idea?
Look, I think there has to be some benefit of getting vaccinated. But of course, the other side is people can't get hold of vaccines. We've heard of regional rural remote Australia being left out of the tent just now, not being able to get vaccines. We know other communities can't get their vaccines. And we have a lower supply level of Pfizer right now, which is the recommended vaccine for those who are under 60. That's why this question has come up. If you're 59 and want to have a vaccine, can you have one? Well, you probably could. The risks are much, much lower at that age group, and the benefits from not getting COVID are much higher, and therefore you'd probably do it. But now with indemnity, you probably could have that discussion, you would do it. It would be a different conversation for somebody who's 40 or 39 or lower, because their risks are higher of the clotting and other side effects and much less of getting an infection. But remember, we've seen around the world now, especially with Delta, the Delta strain, that many people around the world have actually got very sick and died at a younger age. And so that's why we have to be aware of what we're dealing with and what the level of prevailing infection is in our community.
Dr. Mukesh Haikerwal, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that is the show for this week. Join us every Friday at this time. From all of us, Bye for now.